perhaps more importantly is what's going on in the low and medium residential areas. We have mature canopy trees there, big old trees, enormous old trees, and they're really carrying the day in there. And in many cases, we suspect that we've actually seen a situation where available growing space has been lost over the years. So the trees are there, they're established, and when they were big, well-established trees, sidewalks were widened, front yard parking was incorporated, buildings were expanded in some cases. So what we're probably seeing is some sort of artifact of the historical carrying capacity. And I think that's quite interesting in itself. And as we've got up here, that may be a way of indicating some sort of measure of forest sustainability. What's happening to available growing space or potential leaf area. So not just preserving the trees that are there, but preserving the growing space when the 1950s bungalow is being bulldozed to put in a monster home now. So that's the sort of thing that makes planners really nervous when you start saying things like that. Let's preserve space for trees, not just the trees that are there. So what can we do with potential leaf area density? Well, first of all, it gives us an idea of how we're doing. If we've got a big gap between the existing and the potential, can we narrow that gap? Can we do something to reach that potential? If we're looking at a situation where the ratio between the two is very narrow, then let's not worry about it in terms of new planting. Maybe our issues there are tree maintenance, just to keep them on the ground. What factors are limiting potential leaf area density? Is it things like front yard parking, which is a huge issue in the old part of downtown Toronto? Are we losing that potential to that sort of thing, and should we be taking planning measures to do something about that? How can we conserve and increase that potential leaf area density? As I said, once we have a better understanding of what's driving it, what can we do in terms of our planning to improve the situation? Not just looking at planting trees, but retaining and maintaining the potential to carry those trees in the environment. And if we can increase that potential leaf area density, can we relate that back quantitatively to those benefits that I listed earlier on? So very quickly, what are some of the things that are needed? To maximize these benefits, we have to manage that urban forest structure to retain or increase the potential leaf area density. We have to be planting trees that have the genetic potential to become large. In other words, try to avoid the tendency to be planting crab apples where we could be planting white oaks, as long as they're able to support that, the growing space is able to support that tree. And of course, we have to ensure that that tree is going into a growing environment that it can meet its potential, and we have to manage it so that it can meet that potential. Can't simply stick it in the ground and walk away. And of course, as I said, we've got to look at optimizing that distribution over the community. That means public education. Again, a reminder that most of the urban forest is in private property, so big challenges there. Recognition of these values and bringing them to the table at the planning stage. Incorporating these issues right up front, not after the fact, not trying to deal with issues after all the utilities have gone in and the contractor's just heading off the site. We've got to be doing it right at the design stage. Once we have them in the ground, once we have that preserved, we have to have a long-term plan with a vision to manage that resource. And of course, all that has to be driven by good research in all aspects, the biological, socioeconomic, and management aspects, to meet that potential that we've striven to establish on the ground. So this work has been made possible by some funding from the Ministry of the Environment, and of course contributions from the city and all these landowners whose gardens we trampled and spent hours in their backyards peering through their living rooms with transits and so on. We couldn't have done it without them. And graduate students that work with me in the Urban Forest Research Group. So we all had quite a good time last summer doing all this and seeing parts of the city that we've never seen before. Thanks very much for your attention, and there's my email address. If you think of some questions that you want to run by me or some suggestions, that would be great. I'd appreciate it. And if you still have some time, I'm prepared to try to address questions and would be glad to hear comments.
How do you sort of take into account the concept that that homeowner may do other things with that piece of property, such as have a vegetable garden or something like that. And obviously, if I have this big leaf area index or leaf area density, then it's gonna infringe upon what he really wants to do with that.
Yeah,
property.
exactly, and I guess the theory of it being that we wouldn't expect to be able to get to that potential, because a ball diamond may have a huge
Right.
potential, but you don't wanna be planting that up, it sort of gets in the way of the soccer game or the baseball game. So, we still have to look at that top end of potential. But under that definition, we would expect that we wouldn't be able to reach that. That's a good point. We did had a graduate student that looked at cultural perceptions of the urban forest in Toronto a few years ago, where we have Toronto's purported to be one of the most culturally diverse cities in the world, and he was able to quantify some of the differences in perceptions between the Asian community and Mediterranean community and so on. And of course, some of those people like trees, but not in my yard, or down at the end of the street in a park. That's a good point. Yes?
When you were doing your calculation for the potential leaf area density, and you had available growing space, is that based on space for just the canopy, or were you accounting for room volume and things like that?
We assume that below ground would be the drip, the space that we needed for the root system would be the drip line.
So essentially it's the space.
Basically, yeah. We're basically saying you'd at least like to see the drip line, and in most cases you'd be hard pressed to get that. The difference being the canopy could overhang sidewalks and overhang buildings. So that, in other words, you could put a big tree closer to a building than you could a small tree, because ultimately the canopy would overhang the roof, which is what you want. But the root system would be more restricted by pavement and so on.
Foundation.
Yep, exactly. So we really looked at the tree in those two different levels. It was more restrictive below ground than it was above ground.
So the plan is based on below ground restrictions, or?
Yeah, it is, that's taken into consideration, yeah. But all I'm saying is we assumed, in the best case scenario, we assumed the drip line as the extent of the root system, which is, it's not reality, but it makes it easier. Yes, Rick?
I apologize for not being here earlier when you probably said this, but were your leaf area figures specific to different species?
Yeah, in the equation that's used for calculating the existing leaf area density, there's a shading factor incorporated in that, and that shading factor varies by species. So for example, the shading factor for Norway maple is, I don't know, I think it's something like 0.8, and for honey locust it would be 0.65 or something like that. So it's not species specific per se, but there is a factor in there that accounts for it.
And between the hardwoods and conifers, what sort of difference?
There is a difference, but the conifers are calculated a different way. I can't remember how that's done right off the top of my head, but it's incorporated in there, and it's not quite as refined as the definitions for the hardwoods, but at least it accommodates some aspect of the different leaf area. What none of this does is deal with the duration in leaf. So we've got conifers in leaf year round, which is not the case, of course, with the hardwoods. So there's an anomaly there. How much that is having an effect when the trees are dormant, it's hard to say. It depends on what traits you're looking at. Yes?
How do we get people to think more about the root system? And most of the time, people are only interested in the roots when they start lifting up the sidewalk, or something.
That's a really good question, and it sounds trite, but just keep hammering it home. We had a situation on the campus at U of T where there was some construction going on, and they wanted to put a trailer in for for the people working in the construction road, for the maps and plans and everything. And they couldn't put that on the site, so they put it, there was a fairly broad, boulevard in front of one of the other buildings with a couple of, trees next to the sidewalk. And in order to put this trailer in, they came in and scraped off, about 45 centimeters of the topsoil, and then put crushed stone on it, and then put the trailer on it. And of course, half the root system of the trees were gone. When I discussed this with the manager and said, why didn't you just take the crushed stone and put it on top of the turf? It wouldn't have been great for the trees, but it probably would have been a lot better than what they did. It would still give them a stable base. But we said, well, why would it do that? We only went down that far. The perception is that tree roots, this idea that the root system reflects the canopy and that it's, deep and relatively narrow. When you start telling people that most of the roots are in the top 2 feet, then they start to look at that differently. And, confront engineers with it, and when you present it that way, they look at it differently. It's just, they don't understand it, or they never thought of it. They never thought of a tree below ground. One of my colleagues suggested, we were talking about that profile below the ground one day, and he said, well, that's really the suburban environment, so that was kind of neat, suburbia. So, I think just trying to work with them at the planning stage. Yes?
During your presentation, you had a slide with 3 different pictures of different densities of housing.
Yes.
And
Mhm.
you were pointing out how low densities. Were you talking specifically about building densities, or was
Yes,
it also
building.
correlated to population density?
Well, yeah, I was referring to population density, and that's what we used within, we broke out, residential in the high, medium, low, using population density, because it was there in the census data, and we had it in enumeration areas, so we had polygons that we could bring into the map, and we knew what the population and area was, so we could work with it that way. We could also work with building area, which is actually the way the city of Toronto does it. But unfortunately, we couldn't do that in the GIS framework. So I think it still gives you the same sort of idea. And just packing more people in tends to create more hard surface.
Just one final track question here. The most common question I'm asked is, what kind of tree can I plant that doesn't get too big and doesn't make a mess? And what sort of answers should we be giving to those kinds of questions? Because people don't want to plant the big trees, they don't want trees that infringe upon their house, or, those
Yeah.
sorts of things.
Yeah, that's a tough one, and deal with it all the time. Or the other one is, where can I get one of those really nice maple trees that are red year round? And you say, well, Crimson King, Norway maple, we don't want them, they're invasive and everything else, and of course that doesn't matter, I just want that tree in my front yard. I don't think there's an easy answer there. What we're trying to do is work with community groups, ratepayers groups and so on, to do this sort of thing and get them involved. We've got a program that we're hoping to launch this summer to work with community groups to do an urban forest plan for their neighborhood. They do the inventory, they develop their objectives and so on. And we're hoping that through that approach, people will get a better understanding of why it might be a good idea to have big trees there, and why cleaning the gutters out once a year isn't really that big a deal. We won't win everybody over by any stretch of the imagination, but there's no easy answer to that question. It's just put a nice crab apple over there, and yeah, that's great. And if you want, if your objective is aesthetics, then that's fine. But if your objective, and this doesn't work with most individual homeowners, but if your objectives at the city level is something more than aesthetics, then we've got to completely change the way we're doing things. If we can't change the way we're doing things, then let's throw that list of benefits. Let's just throw it out and say the urban forest makes the city look nicer. Nothing wrong with that. That's an important point. But let's not talk about air quality and stormwater attenuation and all these other nice environmental things, unless we're really going to do something in terms of planning and managing the urban forest to meet those objectives. In other words, walk the walk, talk the talk, walk the walk, that's the sort of thing that you have to deal with at another level, of course, not at the individual homeowner who doesn't have that interest up front.
Should we have the analog of zoning in terms of tree planting? Should we have, invade people's private property rights and say, in this area, we should plant these kinds of?
Well, I suppose another way of looking at it is the City of Toronto has a tree cutting bylaw now that states that if you have a tree 30 centimeters DBH and greater, and you want to injure or destroy that tree, you have to have a permit from the city on private property and public property. There was a huge outcry when that came out, but over the 4 or 5 years that it's been in place, that the outcry is waning, and they're recognizing that the city wants to really just have the opportunity to go in, again, at the planning stage and say, if you move that floor plan over a foot this way, or you flipped it over, or you put the garage somewhere else or something like that, you can save that big tree that's gonna have an impact on your property value for one thing. And through that sort of negotiation, they've made some inroads. In some cases, they've also said, no, can't have the permit. Forget it, you can't build the garage. Now, one thing that could be done with, again, looking at leaf area density is this issue of if I take the big oak tree out, what do I have to do to mitigate that? How much do I pay? I can pay the CTLA value, or I can plant 5 trees for the big one that I'm taking out. We had a situation on the U of T campus where 4 big elms were going to be compromised by a new running track. And we had just used our system to do some of the work on the campus trees, and we found that in order to retain the same leaf area, each of those big elm trees would have had to have been replaced by a 35 90 millimeter tree. So once we said that, 35 times 4, people stepped back and said, well, there's something to this. So the running track didn't go in, not just because of that, but I think it helped illustrate the importance of that. So the idea there would be, if the big tree has to come down, you can avoid it. That's fine, but you're going to have to do something to maintain that leaf area somewhere in the city. As much on that site as in Cary, but maybe somewhere else. I suggested that to a developer, and he says, but if I plant 35 trees now, for the one tree I'm taking out, and they all survive, you're going to have more than you lost. And I said, yeah, what's your point? Because you're going to be losing it somewhere else. And he agreed, so a good investment. Great. Thank you very much.